So in part 1 of this video series I made the chessboard, and in part 2 I made the chess pieces. In this video I'm going to be making a box to hold the pieces and the board. I'd mainly use mahogany for the box. This piece was an offcut from a wardrobe panel which I used to make a previous project, this mahogany box. I started by ripping it to the height that I wanted the sides of the box to be, and then I cleaned up the pieces using my thickness planer. The mahogany was quite thick, so to get more out of the material I resawed it at the bandsaw and then thickness planed it again to remove those bandsaw blade marks and to ensure that they were all the same thickness. Then I cut 45-degree miters at the corners, with the length of these pieces sized to fit around the chessboard. I used a stop block to get consistent cuts. Here I'm marking up some housing joints, which I would cut to accommodate some pieces which would split the box into sections, where all the chess pieces would be stored. I lowered my table saw blade to around half the thickness of the mahogany. Then I cut the housing joints wide enough to accommodate the thickness of the pieces, which were around 6mm. My table saw blade kerf is 3mm, so I could make the cuts in 2 passes. I used my crosscut sled and a stop block again to ensure my cuts were consistent on each piece. I cleaned up those cuts with a square file. Then I could assemble the sides of the box. I used masking tape to hold the pieces together at each joint and also to prevent glue squeeze out from getting onto the wood on the inside of the box. I applied wood glue and added some elastic bands to apply pressure to get nice tight joints. Then I checked the box for size, and the chessboard fitted in nicely with about 1mm of play around the perimeter, which I was happy with. Next I could mark up the length of the partitions and cut them to length at the miter saw. There were 5 partitions to add, one which I wanted to be almost the same height as the sides, but about 10mm less that the chessboard would sit on, and 4 half-height ones that would later hold the chess pieces, so I ripped some of these pieces in half at the table saw. I applied some tape again to keep the glue up clean. I ripped the centre partition to the height that I wanted, and then glued that in place. Here I'm cutting some more plywood for the bottom of the box. This is the same plywood that I used in part 1 for the base of the chessboard. I glued the plywood to the bottom of the box. And once it was dry, I planed the edges flush with the sides. The end grain of this plywood will later be hidden by some trim pieces. I did a bit of sanding to the sides of the box with my random orbit sander at 120 grit. For the half-height partitions I could then figure out the spacings to get the pawn chess pieces equally spaced. I'm useless at maths, so I rely on a calculator for this sort of thing. I first marked up where the centre of each piece would be, and then I centered one of the pawn pieces to those marks by eye and marked up the width of the pawn. I'm not going for precise accuracy here, I just want the pieces to look equally spaced by eye. I set my table saw blade to about 10mm in height and made the cuts to remove material based on the markings I'd made. Then I could check the fit, and 1 or 2 slots needed to be cut a fraction wider. I cleaned up the slots with my electric file. This is such a useful tool, and I use it far more often than I ever expected to when I bought it. I could then make the cuts to the rest of the partitions and glue them all in place. With the glue dry, I could then remove the tape. Next, I set up a stop block on the crosscut sled for cutting some slots into the back of each chest piece so that the chest pieces would slot neatly into the box. I moved the fence by 3mm and then made another pass to widen the slot to around 6mm. And then I cleaned up those cuts with a file. So now all of the pieces are in place, and as you can tell, they don't really move around too much. However, I'm a bit concerned about the distance between the top of the chest pieces and the top of the box. I think if the box were to be turned upside down, the pieces would fall out. So I want to try and reduce the height of the box, and I can do that by running each side of the box through the table saw. But the trouble is, the center partition needs to be slightly lower than the sides of the box as it is currently, because the chessboard will sit on top of it like so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the sides of the box on the table saw, and then I'll need to find a way to reduce the height of the center partition to below the height of the sides of the box, if that makes any sense whatsoever. I used the calipers to figure out how high I wanted the sides of the box to be, and then set my fence and made the cuts. So now the sides of the box have been cut, but they're held in place by this central partition. So I'm just going to try and break this apart. I used the hand plane to get the central partition flush with the sides of the box. And then I used a couple of sacrificial scrap pieces of wood in order to balance the router on top of the box, and I used that to cut away the material and lower the height of the central partition. I made 2 passes with the router to get the partition down to the height I wanted. I could then do a bit of cleanup with a chisel and some sandpaper. Next I ripped some more pieces of beech to create a trim for the box. I mitered the trim at the miter saw and then applied glue and clamped it in place with elastic bands and small F-clamps. I did a bit more cleanup with a hand plane and some sanding, and the miter joints turned out really nice. I then added another mitered trim around the bottom of the box to hide the plywood end grain. The next thing I need to do is reinforce these corners of the box, because at the moment they're just moisture joints, so they won't be very strong. And those corner supports will also help to support the board, because at the moment it rocks slightly from side to side because it's resting on the center partition. I ripped a piece of mahogany at a 45-degree angle on the table saw and then cut pieces to length at the bandsaw. Now I'm just going to check that these corner supports are the right height. And that looks pretty good. I need to glue these in place now, and there isn't going to be a simple way of clamping these to the corners, so I'm going to use a mixture of wood glue and the hot glue gun. The wood glue will provide longer term strength, and the hot glue will provide some temporary clamping pressure. I pushed the corner supports in place until the hot glue set. Next I applied some teak oil finish to the box, and in one or two places you can see here there was some dried glue that was showing through, so I scraped that off with a chisel and applied oil again. Unfortunately the board didn't sit level on the corner supports at first, so I needed to chisel away some material to remove the wobble. Then I applied oil to the inside of the box. And finally I made a few finishing touches. I added some adhesive rubber feet to the bottom of the box. I cut some more felt and used epoxy to glue them to the corners of the chessboard so that the board won't damage any surfaces. And also these felt pieces add a soft layer in between the board and the corner supports of the box. I also added some gold ribbon to either side of the bottom of the chessboard, which I attached with a drawing pin after making a small hole with an awl. These pieces of ribbon would be used to lift the board out of the box. Then I applied a spray varnish finish to the box to give it some protection. And finally I added my branding to the bottom of the box using a rubber stamp and sealed that with some more spray varnish. That's the chess set complete, and what began as a simple chessboard project later became a full chess set. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. Good because I like how it turned out, and also I think it's nice that I made the whole thing. And bad because it took such a long time to complete, and I'm just so busy at the moment. I keep getting asked woodwork related favours by friends and family, and that's on top of my already long list of projects that I'm hoping to get to. So I did feel under pressure to get this one finished. I used many different types of wood on this project. The chessboard itself is made from mahogany and I think Iroko, although I'm not 100% sure, and I also used oak for part of the trim. I used the Iroko because it had some spalting running through it, and I just thought it would make for an interesting look. Although it did turn out darker than I expected it to once both the oil and spray varnish finish had been applied, but it still contrasts well against the mahogany, so no big deal. And I really like how the oak trim turned out because it's just a nice pop of colour. The back of the board and bottom of the box was made from a beech veneered plywood, which I bought from my local DIY shop. I think it's beech, although it does have a reddish tint to it when you compare it to the beech chess pieces. And the chess pieces are beech and sapele. The box was made from mahogany with a beech trim. So a real mix, but I think it worked out okay and it looks cohesive. I got the green felt from a shop called Hobbycraft here in the UK, and that was only 55 pence per sheet. And the ribbon was an offcut that I bought from my local fabric shop, and I paid 80 pence for that. I don't play chess, I don't know how to play it, and I'm not really a board game type of person. So throughout this project, I saw this chess set as being something that I would look to sell on once it was complete. I have been meaning to start making things to sell for quite a while now, as ultimately I do want woodwork and upcycling to be my job rather than just a hobby. But now the project is complete, I do kind of like this chest set as a decorative piece, and I'm not really sure whether to sell it or not. Also, when I consider how much time I spent on this project, I'm not sure I'd be able to sell it for the amount that I'd need in order to justify the amount of time I spent on it, if that makes sense. So for the time being, this one will probably sit on a shelf in my house somewhere until I decide what to do with it. Thank you very much for watching as always, and see you next time.